Well, it's a very basic question. I think economists and people in finance have been brought up or trained to think that that is the right thing, that profit maximization is the right thing. And the usual argument is that companies should behave on behalf of their owners, the shareholders, and that's what the shareholders want. I agree with the first part, that companies should act on behalf of shareholders because that's the way most companies are set up. The shareholders have the votes. But I think it's incorrect to say that shareholders always want the companies they own to make as much money as possible. Why is that? Well, first let me say it would be true. They would want profit maximization if the government regulated perfectly and controlled externalities perfectly. But unfortunately, we don't live in such a world. There are many government failures, not least because, let's take the case of climate change, to have really effective regulation, and most economists think that carbon taxes is the way to go on that, you would need carbon taxes throughout the world. So you would need not just one government, but many governments to coordinate on carbon taxes, and that seems extremely difficult to do. So in a situation where the government isn't doing a perfect job, then it turns out that the shareholders of companies may want the companies to sometimes pay attention to externalities. Let me give a few examples. So one example would be that between I think about 1964 and 1990, Texaco was operating in Ecuador, and through its exploration of oil fields, it was creating a lot of pollution in Ecuador, which ended up causing a huge amount of damage and illness and death to people living in Ecuador. And that's something, there wasn't regulation against that. Texaco, which was eventually acquired by Chevron, as a US-based company. There weren't laws in Ecuador saying you couldn't do that. So this could well have been a profit-maximizing decision. But the question is, if you'd asked the Texaco shareholders at the time, they were never asked, but suppose they had been asked, do you like this? Do you approve of this? Yes, you get bigger dividends from this, but there's all that illness and death in Ecuador. Do you like that trade-off? They might have said no. I would like to think they would have said no. So that's an example of one example of how profit maximization may not represent the interests of shareholders. To take another example, let's take an oil company like Exxon, that over the years has sponsored questionable scientific studies that argue that climate change isn't a big problem after all. They used to do this, and they knew very well that this was sort of very questionable science, but it suited their business purpose. And a second thing they have done is to lobby against climate regulation. I believe they're still doing that. I don't think they're doing the first thing, the fake science anymore, but I think they are doing the second thing. Well, both these things may be good for Exxon's bottom line, for its profit, and in fact even for long-run shareholder value. If you just look at the value of Exxon, then if you can convince people that climate change isn't a problem, if you can prevent climate regulation, that could be very good for long-term profitability of Exxon. But let's ask the question. Let's go to the Exxon shareholders. Would they approve of this? Is this good for them? It could be bad for them for three reasons. First, Exxon shareholders typically will hold shares in other companies, and Exxon's, climate change could negatively affect the profits of the other companies they own. That's one reason. The second reason is that the shareholders of Exxon, who are, I'm not talking here about the institutions, but the people behind the institutions, the retail investors, they may not want to live in a hotter world. They may be wealthier, but what good is that if life is unpleasant? They may not want their children or grandchildren to live in a harder world. They may also be other-centered in the way that I would hope the Texaco shareholders would have been with respect to people living in Ecuador. That is, they may be concerned about other people unrelated to them living in a harder world. For all those reasons, they may be against these activities of Exxon. And so they might be willing, if they had the choice, they would, I'd like to think they would say to Exxon, don't do this, even though it's going to reduce your profitability.
I want to start with one of the many tragedies we see in the world. And this is, if you never heard, this is a large bridge, a very long bridge that collapsed 5 years ago near Genova. Now, you think this is Italy, everything is screwed up. And Italy is a beautiful country, but we're not here to take lesson on corporate governance from Italy. However, I wish that was true. So what you see there is the leftover of a 737 MAX. Not the first, the second that collapsed. Now, why did it collapse? Because Boeing decided to cut corner on the production of the new 737 and not tell the FAA and the pilot and the airline companies that the pilots needed retraining. So, of course, when you see all this, people, economists say, oh, but that's obvious. These are externalities, where is the government? It's important to realize that you need an effective government to regulate, enforce and punish. And that self-regulation does not work, and reputational incentives are not enough. But the point I want to underline is that the government very often doesn't work because companies ensure that the company doesn't work. Remember the Italian company with the bridge that was self-regulated? At some point, the Italian government introduced a regulator, and the company lobbied very effectively to be exempted, grandfather from regulation. So this is not the government being not having thought of this, is the company altering the situation. And then you go down the Boeing had captured the entire FAA. In fact, some safety procedure they should have been done by the FAA decided to delegate that to Boeing directly. Volkswagen, Angela Merkel came to the United States lobbying for Volkswagen. So the German government was the lobbying for the Volkswagen organization. It seems that private virtues are transformed into public vices, in which very decent people end up committing or being responsible or producing as a result of a lot of negative outcome. So I think it's legitimate to say that is the problem capitalism itself or the way we have implemented it? So what we claim is that there are several forces that have caused a amoral drift in companies' behavior. One issue is high power incentives. Now, high power incentive combined with limited liability leads managers to take excessive risk from a social point of view. This is not a new idea, it's very well known in finance. However, applies way outside of the finance realm. So think about under-maintaining a bridge. This is clearly an example of risk-taking, as it is to skip safety for a plane. Second is a bit of the nature of the corporate contract. Let's start from the usual example of an entrepreneur that starts a company. We know entrepreneurs maximize utility, not profits. And when multiple investors create a company, can they choose to do the same? So imagine that I start a company and I'm a very devout Christian and I want to actually close my shop on Sunday. If you want a real world example, Chick-fil-A is an example. If you travel through American motorways, is the only thing that you can eat and not get food poison. You know that it's important not to travel on Sunday because they close on Sunday. And I say that is very unprofitable for them to close on Sunday. Okay, it's very unprofitable. They do it because they're Christian and they pose values before value. However, imagine that one of the kids decide not to be Christian anymore. He can sue the company, and then I will get an education from all the lawyers in the room. But my understanding is that if the managers are unwilling to lie, of course they're devout Christian, they will not lie. If you are willing to lie and say that I don't open on Sunday because this maximizes the long-term value of shareholders, you get away with that. But if you say, actually I close it because it's wrong to work on Sunday, at least to my religion, they are gonna lose. And why? Because of the way the fiduciary duty has been interpreted. In Delaware, the legal norm has evolved into the idea that you should maximize shareholder value. Now, as I said, if you lie, you can get away with anything. But that's not enough, because not only the manager should maximize shareholders' value, even if the manager will say, okay, let's put this to a vote to hear what the shareholders want. Now, if you are a fund manager and you are somewhat interested in belonging to an ERISA plan, ERISA requires to act in the interest of the beneficiary. And you said, oh, that's fine, because the interest of the beneficiary can also be the moral value of the beneficiary. Except that there is the Supreme Court of the United States that recently said, no, we should interpret interest as financial interest. So, long story short, if you are managed under ERISA, you have to vote for something that maximizes shareholders' value. But imagine that you manage money of all Christian people who wants to close on Sunday. There is a vote to close on Sunday. You cannot vote what your investors want, because this will violate fiduciary duty. The second aspect is a small but important shift in the way we think about fiduciary duty. The current system is to interpret as maximize shareholders' value, even when shareholders have a different objective. And what we propose is simply that the fiduciary duty should be the act in the interest of the shareholders. And now, of course, you say, how do they know? I'm going to come back in a second. But I think establishing the principle is important. And that implies that if the shareholders want to sacrifice value for values, directors should oblige. In a paper with Eleonora and Sir Oliver, we also showed that if the majority of shareholders is slightly pro-social, not like Mother Teresa, but slightly pro-social, then if asked to vote, they will vote exactly like the social planner would vote. The intuition is very simple, is because they bear a teeny tiny fraction of the cost, but the only state of the world in which their vote will matter is when they are pivotal, and when they are pivotal, can change the world. Imagine that you think about, I'm going to cast the vote that changes the way Exxon behave. There is a lot of social good you generate, and even if you are not that socially inclined, as long as you're not a pure selfish pig, you're going to vote for what is the right thing to do. Wait a minute, if shareholder democracy is so great, why is not work so far? Can shareholders really be consulted on every business matter? And number three, if they are consulted, will they vote? In the United States, 40% of the people don't vote for the presidential election. How can you possibly think they're going to vote for every stock they own, especially if they own a well-diversified index? Now, why shareholder democracy has not worked so far? And I studied this and I discovered the following fact. It's not recent because the SEC until recently have prevented any vote on social issues. So I can say that the SEC has been consistently on the wrong side of history for the last 70 years.